Sheehan was just a penniless college graduate, college dropout, I should have said, with a tiny bit of newspaper experience when he went abroad in 1921 and tried his luck in France. He did speak 3 languages, one of them French, because of his own love for literature, and he got a job as a reporter with the Chicago Tribune at its office in Paris. He did so well there as a cub reporter that he soon became a regular foreign correspondent. And that was a flourishing newspaper, the Chicago Tribune, with a syndicated foreign news service that had dozens of newspapers across the country subscribing. So Sheehan could be read across the nation. And by the time he turned 30, Sheehan had lived and wrote not only in Paris and London, but also in the Rif, in Northern Africa, in Hankow, China in 1927, when the nationalist revolution was taking an initial turn there, in Moscow in the same year, and that's the year this photo was taken. In Moscow, they were celebrating the Bolshevik Revolution, and then in Palestine in 1929, at the first time that violence actually broke out between Arabs and Zionists. Then his unusually compelling narrative of his encounters, which he called Personal History, was published in 1935, vaulting him to international fame. Dorothy Thompson, to take one more example, and I'll just show you a couple of photos of her. Dorothy Thompson also had to support herself since she was a teenager when she went to when she went to London in 1920. She had no newspaper experience, but she started out doing freelance work, getting her pieces bought here and there. She managed to secure unique interviews with rebels and with refugees in Britain, in France, and in Italy. And after making her way a bit, she took the advice of a seasoned newspaper man and made Vienna, starving Vienna in the middle of the new small Republic of Austria, as her home base. She convinced the Philadelphia Public Ledger, another newspaper with a flourishing foreign service, to take her on as a Vienna correspondent, and soon she covered all of Central Europe. She was then promoted to be the head of that newspaper's Berlin Foreign Bureau, a very coveted plum assignment by 1926. Here, I'm showing you these 2 pictures because on your right is her initial one in 1920 when she left rather miserable. She left the United States and she lost her passport, I believe. Anyway, she had to get it again in 1922, and her European experience had clearly changed her and made her something of a different person by then. She came home in 1928 because she married the Nobel Prize winning novelist Sinclair Lewis, but she never lost her international concerns and continued to write, especially about Germany, about the creeping fascism there and about the awfulness of Hitler, until she became, by 1937, the first lady of American journalism, as she was called. By then, she had gained a column 3 times a week in the New York Herald Tribune, where she wrote opposite Walter Lippmann, who wrote on the other 3 days of the week. She also had a weekly radio show, and her passion for writing against fascism was so great that she became very celebrated and also quite vilified. And I wanted to show you just a couple of cartoons that indicate her renown. This is a doctor saying to his male patient, and remember, no more Dorothy Thompson. And rather similarly, here's the famous cartoonist James Thurber in the New Yorker, May 1938. His wife is saying to a friend about her husband typing madly, he's giving Dorothy Thompson a piece of his mind. She did arouse people. And while I haven't had a chance and won't to talk about the other 2, I wanted to show you that John Gunther, the third famous one of my characters, also deserved a New Yorker cartoon after he wrote his books that all began with the word inside. Inside Europe, inside Asia, etc. This is a Helen Hokinson cartoon of 1940, where the little old lady in the bookstore says, "Isn't it about a time another one of John Gunther's insides came out?" So there we end our pictures. And I want to say a few words in conclusion about when I started to write this book. I had the intention to write about the 1920s younger generation, and I hope to portray them better than the caricatures or ways I have seen them treated, which I always thought were inadequate. And I have approached that question of the modern selves of individuals of this generation by integrating the private lives of my characters with their public profiles in the book. But I did not expect initially to emphasize international experiences or global journalism. These were elements I discovered as I began to research members of that generation, and that became dominant. Nor did I expect to find such ominous parallels between the world my figures walked through and lived in and our own. Parallels in the worldwide ascent of authoritarian and proto-fascist governments, and political cleavages in many places between left and right, stark enough to cause street violence. The parallels are there. It was the experience of the Great War that taught savvy observers that modern governments, whether they are fascist, communist, or representative, could speedily disseminate manipulated or false public information to a mass public. And in the 30s, a growing number of authoritarian states did so very effectively, completely clamping down on freedom of the press. Sheehan and Thompson wrote passionately about these things. They saw dictators corrupting legal rule, bringing associated horrors that are also lamentably familiar with us right now. Americans too today are deeply divided over the nation's role abroad. What should its international role be, as well as they're divided about much else. So my book became more of a history lesson for today than I would have anticipated initially. And now I want to hand the mic over or back to Chris to introduce Sandy Zip.
All right, thank you, Nancy, for those comments and getting us started this evening. And now I'm going to briefly introduce Professor Samuel Zip, known to many of us as Sandy Zip, who is a cultural and intellectual historian and also an associate professor of American Studies and Urban Studies at Brown University. Sandy is a creative thinker. He is an omnivorous researcher and a gifted writer. Curious in particular about how ideas work in the world when the sort of the rubber of ideas hits the road of institutions, of urban landscapes, and of state power. And all of that is on display in both of his books that he's written, as well as in his more sort of public-facing writing for daily newspapers and for sort of magazines of ideas, which you should check out. But in particular, his first book, Manhattan Projects, The Rise and Fall of Urban Renewal in Cold War New York, and also the book that he'll be discussing this evening, The Idealist, Wendell Willkie's wartime quest to build one world, published this year by the Belknap Press of Harvard University Press. And I'll turn it over now to Sandy.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much, Chris, for that introduction, and thanks to everybody at the Mahindra Center, and particularly Susie Clark for having me, and the staff for getting this set up. I'm really glad to be here with Nancy Cott, because I think of The Idealist as a kind of sequel to Fighting Words, and I want to talk to you a little bit about how that works today. And I'm going to share my screen first to give you a few slides to look at and other things. Right. So I think of it as a sequel in many ways because the period that I deal with is World War II. And I'm talking about Wendell Willkie's career and his work during World War II. And Willkie was a friend and colleague of many of the characters that Nancy talks about. Dorothy Thompson, John Gunther, Vincent Sheehan. He knew all of them and was influenced by all of them. Sometimes was a political ally of theirs. Other times he was a bit of a combatant of theirs, but he's an inheritor of many of the ideas and experiences that they pioneered during the 1920s and 30s. But that whole world, that whole sort of connection or linkage between these figures has been lost, I think, and as our title suggests, sort of hidden from larger public view. The story of Wendell Willkie's World Travels, his best-selling book, and the idea of one world have been hidden in at least two kind of overlapping ways that I want to get at today. First, I think that when we recall Wendell Willkie today, we're most likely to recall the fact that he was the losing candidate in the 1940 election to President Roosevelt, of course. So in some sense, Willkie is one of the most famous also-rans in US history. Sometimes when we tell the story of Wendell Willkie, when we do at all, when he's remembered at all, we think of him as a sort of Indiana native who rose to sort of public stardom as an opponent of the New Deal in the 1930s, and he was drafted by these liberal Republicans to run against Roosevelt, even though he had been a Democrat his entire life. He switched parties and in a quite extraordinary campaign for the presidency in 1939 and 40, won the nomination even without entering any primaries in a floor fight at the convention. And then went down to defeat to Roosevelt in the 1940 election. And many accounts of Willkie really rest on this story, suggesting that he helped to take the US into World War II by sort of quelling the so-called isolationist voices in his own Republican Party, because he was himself, like Roosevelt, an internationalist. And thus, by that power, sort of prepared the way for the fabled and now threatened liberal world order that was established during and just after World War II through Roosevelt's efforts, and sort of by proxy through Wendell Willkie's efforts at quelling the isolationist opinion in the Republican Party. So that's very often the way we understand who Wendell Willkie was. But I want to suggest that this is not his most important legacy, at least not the most important story about his legacy, and that thinking of it as the most important story surrounding Willkie has very much obscured or hidden his greatest legacy, which is the much maligned idea of one world, which really gives us a different trajectory for American internationalism, or a different possible alternative trajectory for American internationalism that doesn't just simply lead to the liberal world order that was established after World War II, right? It opens up a view into a time during World War II when there were many different possibilities for how the United States might greet the world. And Willkie's idea of one world really represented one of the most popular of them, one of the most powerful of them. And my book tells the story of how that idea came to be, its brief shining moment in the sun in the 1940s, and the way that it was eclipsed. And the book really focuses on Wendell Willkie's journey around the world in 1942, the first place where this new vision for him that he began to champion, began to flourish, began to rise up. And then the way that that idea, One World, crystallized with his book in 1943, One World, and how Willkie and that idea, how they represented or symbolized some of the dilemmas of what we today offhandedly call globalization 3/4 of a century ago. So I'm recalling that journey and that idea in the hope that his ideas might be of some use to all of us during our own times of global crisis, just as Nancy suggested a minute ago. So the phrase one world comes from the title of Willkie's 1943 bestseller. He wasn't the first to use the term one world. Many internationalists with similar ideas had used it in one way or another, but it was his vast popularity and visibility, the quasi-celebrity that he enjoyed during World War II, that gave the term the power to signify a whole world view. And just like Nancy's book, my book reveals a sort of larger cultural history of this celebrity, how Willkie's political fame arose at the heart of what I call the age of broadcasting, a time when the circuits of information pioneered by those characters that Nancy wrote about in the 1920s and 30s had really reached their peak, right? The radio networks, the news wires, the syndication services, the newsreels, the picture magazines, and before the media fragmentation that would be unleashed in the wake of the television revolution of the 1950s and 60s. In many ways, this one world worldview that Wilkie embodied was quite simple. Wilkie announced it in the opening moments of his book. As he said there are no distant points in the world any longer. The airplane and a global war had combined, he argued, not only to shrink space, but also to push Americans towards a new understanding of the nation's political responsibilities. All the world's peoples were being drawn closer together, he said, while the United States in particular was now inescapably enmeshed with the rest of the world. Our thinking in the future, he declared, must be worldwide. Now, these insights were the product of a journey, as I mentioned, that Wilkie took around the world in the late summer of 1942 to visit the battlefronts. Carrying messages to Allied leaders from his former rival, President Roosevelt, Wilkie flew 31,000 miles in 49 days, making stops in the Middle East, the Soviet Union, and China. Upon his return to New York, 36 million people tuned in to hear his Report to the People, which was broadcast over all the radio networks. One World, which reached about 4 million readers when it was published the next year, 1943, gave that vast audience an account of that trip and was the culminating act in Wilkie's rise to become a popular icon of global idealism. I tell the full story of that trip in The Idealist. His stops across Africa, the Middle East, Russia, and Asia, in Nigeria, Sudan, Egypt, Turkey, Lebanon, Palestine, Iraq, Iran, the Soviet Union, and China, the people he met in Cairo, Ankara, Beirut, Jerusalem, Baghdad, Tehran, Moscow, and Chongqing, from Charles de Gaulle to Joseph Stalin to Chiang Kai-shek, and a host of other leaders and ordinary people in between. The book gives you a sense of what he encountered there, a world of insurgent peoples whose desires for freedom did not make it into the headlines or newsreels carrying war news across the globe. He discovered a planet poised between two sort of great world ordering forces, the European empires, the British, the French, the Dutch, that had shaped the globe since the late 19th century and before, and then the new rising power of the United States, which was struggling with itself to figure out how it would greet, understand, and interact with the world it was poised to dominate in the years after the war. One World was written for Americans to try to get them to actually confront the world as it was. And the most important thing for Americans to understand about the world, Wilkie believed, was that its oneness was a new geopolitical and emotional reality that Americans had yet to really see and to understand. In a speech in 1943, not long after the book came out, he said, "We can stop thinking of the world today as a geographical map, splotches of color that stand only for nations and national possessions. And, quote, we can begin to think of the human beings who live within those splotches of color as living also within a larger map that marks a single world." One World featured a map of this transnational single world called Flight of the Gulliver here on your screen. This map did away with the borders and those splotches of color that signified national collectivity. And it showed instead this kind of great blue-green spread of ocean and continents connected only by the vector of Wilkie's voyage. So for him, this new universal world space offered a clear political lesson. The peace, as he put it, must be planned on a world basis, making real the full global interdependency that he hoped would push Americans to avoid the two threats to future world peace: isolationism on the one hand and empire on the other, both of which were underpinned by what he called narrow nationalism. However, Wilkie brought something else home to Americans as well. This map, The Flight of the Gulliver, depicted not only the single world, but also a kind of new world geography, a sort of new depiction of the world. The world was not only becoming one, Wilkie argued, it was being reshaped in these years, right? And in reflecting the kinds of things that Vincent Sheehan and John Gunther and Dorothy Thompson had discovered out in the world in the 20s and 30s, he argued that perhaps the most significant fact in the world today is the awakening that is going on in the East. This realization pushed him to challenge Americans to see the demands of the world's colonized peoples. He was, as he wrote in the closing moments of One World, only passing on an invitation which the peoples of the East have given us. Here, Wilkie is addressing a crowd in Chongqing, China's wartime capital. And from the Middle East to China, lands under various degrees of current or historic sway to European powers, Wilkie had made himself, through his trip and through his writings and through his speeches, into a kind of medium, not only for the idea of a unified world, but also for the widespread demand that the freedom for which the Allies fought should be sort of extended unilaterally and without regard for colonialism. Men and women all over the world, he wrote in One World, are on the march, physically, intellectually, and spiritually. Old fears no longer frighten them. They are no longer willing to be Eastern slaves for Western profits. The big house on the hill, surrounded by mud huts, has lost its awesome charm. For people everywhere, he said, in Africa, in the Middle East, throughout the Arab world, as well as in China and the whole Far East, freedom means the orderly but scheduled abolition of the colonial system. But Wilkie didn't stop there. He issued a challenge to Americans as well. The moral atmosphere in which the white race lives is changing, he wrote late in One World. It is changing not only in our attitude toward the people of the Far East, it's changing here at home. The United States, he charged, had long, quote, practiced inside our own boundaries, something that amounts to race imperialism. This image shows one of Wilkie's 1940 campaign ads touting his stance on civil rights issues. He had been involved in civil rights efforts for several years before his trip, and his progressive views had earned him the support of many African Americans in the 1940 election, including the endorsement of major Black newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier. But it was his trip that really allowed him to see how American ideals of freedom were at stake and could be found wanting. It was these our imperialisms at home, as he called them, that were the most dangerous thing to undermining America's full confrontation with the stakes of World War II and of their role in the world after the war. During a war against fascism and militarism, he realized, when colonized peoples were making their freedom dreams known, the United States had to look to its own inequalities as well. He wrote, "It is becoming increasingly apparent to thoughtful Americans that we cannot fight the forces of and ideas of imperialism abroad and maintain any form of imperialism at home. The war has done this to our thinking." I think Wilkie was almost alone, with the exception perhaps of Eleanor Roosevelt, as a mainstream white political figure with the cultural reach to access literally millions of American homes, in labeling domestic segregation as akin to colonialism, as a kind of imperialism at home. Right? This is the kind of rhetoric that was well known on the African-American left and in African-American civil rights circles, which where he learned it primarily from Walter Wright of the NAACP. But this was not unheard of, but very rare to be heard outside of, in mainstream circles, for people who were just reading daily newspapers in the larger white mainstream world. Overall, Wilkie argued the fate of the United States rested on challenges that were both within and beyond the nation's borders. As a result, he urged Americans to embrace a sense of reciprocity with the world. American power and independence in the post-war world, Wilkie argued, would require embracing interdependence with others. And interdependence is a kind of key word for Wilkie. Interdependence with the world was in turn dependent on the independence of subject peoples, both at home and abroad. And so American independence, right, that key word of American political democracy, its freedom to act in the post-war world required it to work to end colonialism and racism, both at home and abroad. He said, the way to make certain that we do recover our traditional American way of life with a rising standard of living for all is to create a world in which all men everywhere can be free. So Wilkie's sort of newly interdependent world, his shrinking world, was intended to call into question rather than reaffirm unquestioned assumptions about American or even Western dominance of the world. The lack of capacity for self-governance in the colonized world, or the hierarchies of race undergirding those assumptions. The United States, he argued, was enmeshed in a larger world in which its power relied on its efforts to advance the freedom of the peoples of the globe, not just the United States' promise that it abstractly stood for that freedom around the world. Wilkie wasn't perfect. He challenged Americans, But he also was not immune to the idea that Americans could fix the world. And this is a third sort of wrinkle in the dilemmas of interdependence and dilemmas of proto-globalization in the one world era. In many ways, his worldview depended on the centrality of the United States. In fact, he thought that one of the things that bound all people together in the new one world was fondness for the United States. Chief amongst those ideas, he said, which, quote, millions and millions of men hold in common, was the mixture of respect and hope with which the world looks to this country. The United States, he reported, enjoyed an unprecedented reservoir of goodwill out in the world. Now, there's quite a bit more to be said about this, and there's much more in the book. But in the interest of time, I just wanted to note the way that Wilkie's adoption of the trope of goodwill ran somewhat counter to the sense that he otherwise gave of a world rising up to demand and win its freedom from empire. If, as he said, he intended to bring back to the United States an invitation which the peoples of the East have given us, the logic of goodwill appeared to cut in another direction. By that measure, the United States sat at the heart of the world's expectations. The opportunity and power lay not with those levying demands for freedom, but with Americans, whose store of goodwill was the measure of their benign intentions. The very rhetoric of goodwill that Wilkie deployed suggested that the interdependence he sought could not be guaranteed only by the presence and power of the United States to protect it. So by these lights, I think this map, right, we'll return here to the Flight of the Gulliver, looks like a map instead of a totally interconnected world being transformed by the insurgency against imperialism, but perhaps a map of American world influence or of future American world influence. And Wilkie reveals America's supposedly or hopefully benevolent sway over a unified globe that nonetheless occludes the very presence of American empire and power itself to shape the fate of that globe. And that's one of the great dilemmas at the heart of Wilkie's presentation of the idea of one world and of its very popularity, right? So I hope I've given you a sense of how Wilkie embodied the dilemmas of global interdependence. He popularized the idea of one world, an anti-racist view of the world that hoped to create a more democratic shape for a future world order, one that hoped to end empire and give smaller countries a greater role on the world stage. And in the book, you can read about how that vision fared during the founding of the United Nations and the coming of the Cold War. But what I've hoped to share with you today is how Wilkie's vision reflected not only the ambivalent and charged dilemmas of his own moment, but of the globalized times we all live in today. As I try to show in the conclusion to my book, Wilkie's ideas predicted our own times. Like other internationalists, he suggested the way that some kind of widely shared ethos of global connection that went beyond the formal governance and even cooperation of nation states would be necessary to handle an increasingly global challenge that modern life presented to more and more people, and particularly to Americans. But that sort of recalcitrant current of nationalism that also worked its way through his work and his ideas suggested how hard this would be to achieve. And I think we can all see this, particularly now, of course, in this time of a global pandemic. We can see how the brutal effects of that pandemic have been accelerated here in this country by a sense that the US can and should just go it alone. We face something of a referendum on all of this next week, of course. And Wilkie's story gives us a sense of what the stakes really are and how they go back to an earlier time of widely shared global crisis. Thanks very much, and back to you, Chris.
All right, thank you very much to Sandy, and also, of course, before that to Nancy. Just to let people know what we're going to do next, I'm going to sort of ask a couple of questions to both of the authors and invite them to respond to each other and put these books in dialogue. Then we'll open it up to anyone who wants to put a question in the Q&A. So feel free to type some questions in there now. We probably won't get to them for about 10 or 15 minutes, but think about that, and I'll start assembling those questions as we go along. But I wanted to just start both of you off with maybe a reflection on both the title of our panel and then also some of the unlearning work that this evening is doing and that your books are doing, and in some ways continue to need to do and in two ways. One is to come back to this term hidden. And Sandy, you talked a little bit about how you think Wendell Willkie's story and also his legacy have been hidden, but maybe both of you to reflect on hidden versus lost, or forgotten or suppressed, or missed opportunities. You know, what was possible then, and what has happened to it since. And then related to this is also the question of the unlearning, and that's unlearning a sort of common sense opinion that many people have, that the United States became, quote, more isolationist after the First World War, right? And I think both the people you write about were sort of writing against that, and you in many of your ways continue to write against that. And you know, why is that task so persistently necessary when historians for so long have demonstrated that it was not true? So take it away.
Well, if I can jump in here, let me say first that you're giving us a lot of credit for the word hidden being extremely intentional. Conceivably lost would work as well. But let me say that for my subject and my figures, that the main reason they, as individuals, are unknown now is the fate of journalists in general to be regarded as writers of ephemera. And this is something I think historians themselves are very guilty of. And in general, I believe now that the history of journalism and of important journalistic work has not really been integrated with what is considered history. There are histories of journalism, but it's a separate field altogether. And I think that's really a mistake. Today, when there is so much discussion of what is in public, in newspapers, cable TV, social media, et cetera, and we see how tweets or bots are influencing what people think, there may be more recognition that the way public information is presented through journalism and other means is a crucial part of understanding what's going on, and that people who engage in those fields are political players, are participating in the making of history. And I think they were in the past. Also, let me just say too, from the point of view of the isolationism question and why the interwar period is not treated in the way I propose to treat it here, which is as one long period of recovering from or assimilating the damage done by the Great War. I do think this is attributable in US history to the great propensity to look only at national issues and not to place the US in international perspective. So therefore, to really divide the 20s from the 30s because of economic conditions being so different in the two decades. And obviously, this is being dealt with by certain historians, but not by others. And the isolationist moniker is so handy because there are many instances of the US acting either nationally in national policy, for instance, in immigration restriction, and culturally in the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the skewering of the teaching of Darwinism. There are many ways in which the 20s was fundamentalist, backward looking, and parochial. But I see that importantly as part of a great central tension in the whole period of the 20s and 30s between that kind of provincialism and a growing cosmopolitanism or sense of the international and the traveling the world as something that American citizens had to be cognizant of. I think I should give Sandy a chance.
I think one of the reasons that I wanted to write this book and to try to sort of recover a fuller account of Wendell Willkie and One World was that I see this moment during World War II, these years between, say, 1941, when the Atlantic Charter was announced by Roosevelt and Churchill, and 1944, when the shape of the United Nations really began to take shape, the years in which Wilkie made his big name around these internationalist issues, when One World was published, when his trip occurred. I see these as kind of a sort of hinge moment in the 20th century. In one way, it's a kind of fulfillment of everything of the 20 to 30 years that came before it, just as we've been discussing, right, leading back to World War I. And then in many ways, it set the stage for the next really 3/4 of a century, right? This week we're celebrating, or some people are celebrating, it hardly seems to get any attention, but we're celebrating the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, right? It was actually just this past weekend. It was celebrated. And while few Americans seem to pay much attention to that, it is a kind of great global event and should be remembered as such. And Wilkie's story gives us a way to see how that moment 75 years ago was produced out of the time period of the 1920s and 30s. It's about how the politics of the 1920s and 30s coalesces in this moment where many different things were possible, and some were foreclosed and some were opened up, some were transformed into different kinds of tendencies. I mean, I think, Nancy, you've written in your book, but also elsewhere, how we tend to remember the Americans who went abroad in these years as the quote unquote lost generation. You have a sort of literary story, and you mentioned this earlier, right? But in many ways, really, we should remember these journalists who opened Americans' eyes to the world. And it was Wilkie who, in some ways, sort of summed up all their efforts, right? His book, a kind of work of popular nonfiction, just like the ones that they wrote. He was in some attempt, you might say he was trying to imitate the popularity of Inside Asia by John Gunther, right? By trying to show the rest of the country what was at stake in opening up to the world, and trying to model for them what it would be like to have this kind of open, sort of expansive view of the rest of the world. And I think it's really hidden because it got closed down by the Cold War, and we replaced the story of people like John Gunther and Dorothy Thompson and Raina Rafelson with the story of the lost generation, and we replaced Wilkie with a series of stories about realism and idealism in foreign policy, both of which were nationalistic models for the practice of professional foreign policy that were actively working and quite explicitly working to push the one world ideals off the stage of political debate in the years between 1943 and 1945, as the United Nations was being formed and as power was being located in the Security Council and taken away from what would become the United Nations General Assembly, which was the vision that Wilkie had, was a much more expansive organization that would give much more democratic power to those smaller states. Wilkie died in 1944, quite surprisingly, in October of 1944, just as the Dumbarton Oaks Conference was getting going. That was the first conference to try to organize the UN. And so he didn't see the UN the way it manifested and how his ideas were both fulfilled and betrayed, although he wrote a bunch of newspaper articles and many pieces trying to influence that, the sort of anti-colonial tendencies in the formation of the UN and its more democratic tendencies, in some ways to no avail.
Oh, great, thank you, and thank you for continuing on while I briefly disappeared from Zoom. So I'm glad to be back with you. I wanted to switch gears now and ask you to reflect both historically and maybe also across disciplines on travel, and I'll give you a quote that you've heard 100 times before, right? In 1869, in Innocents Abroad, Mark Twain observed that, quote, "Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness. And many of our people need it sorely on these accounts." Our people, in that case, meaning Americans. And you both write about people for whom travel was personally transformative in different ways, and also part of a political project for them, right? And part of how they imagined the U.S. Becoming the kind of internationalist America that they sort of imagined it needed to be. This, of course, is also a time of refugee movements, of forced population transfers, of immigration restriction, mobilities and immobilities that were themselves political. And so I'm curious sort of what you think history has to show for thinking about travel, and also how, if at all, you drew from other kind of scholars who've thought about travel from geography, from literary studies, or from other fields?
Well, I'll say, first of all, I see the point of the quotation from Twain, and certainly it worked that way for the characters I focused on. But I don't think it's universally true, because the context within which one travels uh, really matters. I'm thinking of certain confrontations that Sheehan had with um, dignitaries of the British Empire, whom he met in the Middle East, say, or North Africa, who remained utterly prejudiced even as they moved around within the empire, because their movements were structured by certain assumptions that structured the empire, and they weren't rebelling against that. But I think more generally, yes, the fact that Americans became more able to travel after the Great War, and also many of them had more incentive to travel, at least to Europe, because Americans had fought there. And this was the period when the summer trip to Europe started to become something that people in college did. There was an immense expansion of that kind of touristic travel. And I do think, though, the framework in which one travels, whether open-mindedly and open-endedly, or whether to have one's prejudices confirmed, and there are things along the way in between there, of course, but I think that's crucial. And in terms of whether travel literature by scholars was something that interested me, I have to say I'm aware of it, but it didn't influence me in this book, because it was at least as much the stays, the residences, the sojourns in various countries, the getting immersed, that influenced these people's views as the literal travel. Yes.
Yeah, I think that it would be it would be correct to call One World a travelogue or a travel book. And in some ways, it drew on genres of travel literature and travel writing. But I think in many ways, it was based on a kind of genre of American nonfiction, again, exemplified by some of Nancy's characters, that tried to give the sort of factual account of the world at large in order to broaden Americans' ideas about what was happening in the world. And, Wilkie's trip was very much about opening his eyes to the world, right? And the entire way that he presented what he experienced back to his vast audience through reporters and newspapers, and through all the newspaper men and women who greeted him on the tarmacs everywhere he landed across the Middle East, Soviet Union, and China, was to try to give people a sense of this sort of opening and expanding world of learning new things, but new things that would also be, in some sense, wouldn't be a irreparable challenge to American life. They would simply be the kind of there would be the kinds of kind of nice goad to Americans to become more involved with the rest of the world. Right. So in many ways, his travels in One World forewent some of the exoticism that went into much travel writing. Right. That sort of feeling of seeing the world as a kind of a place that's outside of ourselves or other from ourselves, and tried to reconcile it with Americans' views of the world. Right? That has its hazards as well, and as I suggested when I was talking before, left there being some sense that perhaps Americans didn't have to do much to transform their relationship with the world. And I think that actually had as much influence on the post-war world and the post-war sort of American attitude towards the rest of the world, where Americans felt free to travel around the world, to go to the world, but didn't feel a whole lot of responsibility or need to take in a whole lot from the rest of the world, right? And that leaving themselves feeling they were still at the center of the world.
If I can just pick up on something that Sandy mentioned, it's quite striking that Wilkie very emphatically, as well as several of my characters, especially Sheehan and Raina Raphaelson, became strongly anti-imperialist, anti-colonial when they traveled to various parts of the world. And not only places, I'm thinking of China, not only places that were literally colonized, but places that had felt the very strong oppressive impress of European empires.
Yeah.
And it's very striking how quickly they picked up on the uh, just rights of oppressed peoples. Yet at the same time, none of them, including Wilkie, recognized that America had its own distant empire. No one ever mentioned the Philippines. No one ever mentioned the West Indies. Uh, so even though, I mean, Wilkie's anti-racism is quite striking, and none of my characters, except potentially Sheehan, who was also a friend of Walter White, the head of the NAACP, and did in the 40s write some anti-racist material. But none of them was that overt. Yeah, but I think it's very striking that this generation, of which Wilkie was a sort of older member, um, were so unable to recognize America's own colonialism. And this is true too, interestingly, among the American missionaries abroad that David Hollinger has recently written about, who themselves sympathize very much with subjected peoples under European imperial rule, but had no criticism about America's administration of its overseas possessions.
For Wilkie, he recognized the fact of American empire, but he seemed to think it was all going to go away, that America would just as naturally of a course abandon its colonies. And I think what that made it hard for him to see was the transformation of American empire from a kind of hemispheric and colonial based empire, right, which remains today, to its sort of world domination, that form of empire, that form of informal empire, if we want to call it that. Hotly contested phrase. One of the things that this means for these books, and Nancy, you just mentioned it early on there in your comment, is that there's a lot of very interesting, just like with Gunther and Sheehan, there's a lot of very interesting anti-British sentiment that goes into Wilkie's trip. Wilkie had a very sort of touchy relationship with Winston Churchill, which is traced throughout my book. And it's interesting to rejuvenate, to find that history again of tension between Americans and British people over colonialism, and the sort of judgment of Americans that they were somehow better than British for their lack of colonialism, right? Not understanding. The British, of course, made great hay of this. They thought it was ridiculous that the Americans would be lecturing them about Africa and India when they weren't prepared to give freedom to Puerto Rico or Hawaii. But that's an interesting lost history we have of the special relationship, right? It's this tension that kind of exists within it, especially during World War II, just up before it.
That's great. No, thank you both for that. And I want to just switch gears briefly and ask you to, not so much about the history you wrote, but how you wrote the histories that you did, and just spend a little time, before we open it up to the Q&A, on how you got the idea for the book, other literary paths you considered but didn't take. In Nancy's case, maybe how you cast this cast of characters, why these four and others you might have considered. And then I'd also invite both of you to reflect on the genres of history and biography. And for those of you who have not read these books, they didn't read to me as biographies in the traditional sense, but I'm sure you have read many biographies as you wrote these books. How do you see yourself in dialogue with these different genres? So it's an open-ended question to reflect on the writing process.
Well, I'll start off, but be brief so we leave time for the audience questions. As I said, I always intended to write about the 1920s generation in a way that involved real people. This was because of other books I had written, and I wanted this book to be quite different. I wanted it to be a narrative. I wanted it to have real people who were in the forefront. And I was interested in the younger generation of the 1920s. And I did begin by reading many biographies and autobiographies. And that's when I was struck with how many of these people went abroad, not just to Europe, but various places around the world in their youth, and that had a significant impact on how they formed their identities. I even did a reference search in reference works that included thousands of names And these reference works, of course, included only people who became notable in their lives. But I found that for this cohort, this generational cohort, between a quarter and a third of them actually spent significant time outside the United States when they were young, in the 20s and 30s. So that was very striking. But when it came to decide who to write about, I initially had a very large cast of characters who were, and made the book impossible to write. And around 2016, I guess, I was partly gripped by the current crisis in journalism. And I began to feel that the journalists really did cohere as a group and could make the most possibly structured book around this theme. And that's what made me focus on them. And I chose these four really because I could find private papers of theirs, correspondence they wrote to intimate friends and lovers at the time, and I could illuminate their private lives. Also, I was very taken up with the world of print through their lives. And in fact, a friend who was reading drafts early on said that she felt my book was an elegy for print journalism, which in some ways it is, although I think it's a premature elegy, actually, these days. But it was really an evolution in my path as to how I came to these people and these emphases. And I never intended to write a biography. I do not see this even really as collective biography, which it has sometimes been called, or group biography. I really see it as using individuals to illuminate a larger historical period of time and of historical possibility. I was very influenced, although without realizing it until later, I was actually very influenced by a comment made in a book by Christopher Lasch that was written in 1965. That book was called The New Radicalism in America, The Intellectual as a Social Type. And in it, he profiled a series of people, one after the other. And he said in this beginning, he said, these people aren't representative in the usual sense, but they're representative in that their lives could not have been lived in any other time in just this way. And I feel that very strongly about the four figures I wrote about.
Yeah, I think similar to Nancy, I was trying to capture a moment as much as tell a biographical story. But I think that finding a character on which to hang the story of this moment was really important for me. I began this book sort of on a whim in some ways, because in my first book that you mentioned, Chris, about urban renewal in New York City, I wrote a whole chapter on the history of the building of the United Nations headquarters complex. And in that, I discovered the internationalist writings of the essayist E.B. White, who we all know best as the author of Charlotte's Web and Stuart Little, and some of his essays in Harper's and the New Yorker from those years, right? The kind of one of the great sort of icons of American middlebrow writing. And it turns out that White was a big internationalist himself. In fact, a proponent of world government of all things. And almost no one mentioned this anymore. I mean, his biographers, of course, do, and there are evidence of that in his letters. A lot of the essay collections of his have had it sort of pushed to the side, but he wrote a whole book about it called The Wild Flag in 1946. So I got interested in this, and I started thinking maybe there's a portrait here of people that I came to call popular internationalists, people who brought internationalism to a huge audience. And I always knew about Wilkie and thought of him as perhaps the sort of central figure in this larger, broader array of people. Dorothy Thompson was someone I was considering as part of this array of people when I first started. But I soon came to see that sort of hanging it on Wilkie might be the most fascinating thing to do, because it covered all the angles. You had him as a political figure, you had him as a kind of sort of all of a sudden literary figure with the great success of One World, and this sort of quasi-celebrity that tied in all both the cultural and the political aspects of this era. And it became clear that he was in many ways the chief icon of this era of popular internationalism. And also, in some sense, its most tragic figure, if you think of him as having both sort of succeeded beyond his wildest dreams and also at the very last instant, in some sense, failed to see through his visions. So that's really how I came to see this as the core of this story. As I began to write, I realized that what I had on my hands was also a story about 13 places around the globe where Wilkie landed and the context in which he found himself there. And so for those who are interested in stories of what it was like in Egypt or Tehran or Baghdad or Ankara or Moscow or Chongqing, my book tells stories of his encountering these places and what he saw there and how they all wrap together to shape the possibility of the United States trying to really confront what was emerging there. And to try to do that as a portrait of a moment, not so much as a kind of biography of one figure. The other thing to say about Wilkie, and I'll stop there, is that it's hard to write a biography of Wilkie. Many have tried, because he's not a particularly privately revealing figure. He has no journal, he has no diaries, he did not write personal letters very often. So what he remains is this quintessentially an extremely public figure, somebody who was quite at home in the world of journalism, of media, of politics, of the back and forth of the public world, but for whom we have very little sense of his interior world. And so he really does, one commentator called him sort of a plastic figure. He really does exist in this world, and that makes him both exciting and a little bit, a little bit of a challenge to handle, let's just say.
Yeah. Well, great. I think the fact that you're both still so excited about people that you've spent, sort of many years with, is a sign of just how much is waiting for readers in the books. And what you just said actually set up nicely some of the questions that have been coming through in the Q&A. So I'm going to turn to some of those now, and again invite people to add some more to the Q&A. I wanted to actually get at this question of public and private, because this actually shows up in one of the very first questions, and is, I think, maybe primarily for Nancy, but really for anyone or either of you, which is sort of as you sort of wrote about people, your subjects, you merge the public and the private in your narrative, right? Can you tell us more about the role, in particular, of sexuality? That of the characters themselves, and also the changing histories of sexuality and politics of sexuality of the 1920s, and how that's part of this Fighting Words as well.
Well, it is an important part of my exploration of what it meant to be a modern person, that none of these characters followed conventional sex lives. And from other work I've done on the 20s as well, and people born from the 1890s to the early 1900s, I actually think that the first sexual revolution, if we can call it that, of the 20s was far more broadly important than historians have made it. We don't typically think of the 20s as a time when birth control became available, but it was in the form of the inadequate condom mainly, but it made an immense difference to people living then. And I was chuckling when Sandy mentioned E.B. White, because he and James Thurber together, when they were at the New Yorker in 1929, wrote a book called Is Sex Necessary?, which was a spoof on all the sex manuals that were coming out at that time, in which they said it's clear that sexual freedom and marriage are in conflict. Therefore, marriage will have to go. They were definitely supporting sexual freedom outside marriage. And all of my characters thought that was okay. And so I carry explorations into their private lives into the book, I think, and I feel that this is a lesson of feminist history, really, that people don't achieve their public successes alone. Most people do that in relation to significant others in their life, not necessarily sexual intimates, but significant others of many sorts. And it's rare, except in an individual biography where it is very often done, but it's rare in historical writing about public figures to have much of an eye toward who were the intimates in their lives or the private events that made a difference for them, either drove them or stopped them. So it was really very important to me, and much of the lives of these people who were all young adults in the period I wrote about them was their sexual and marital travails, because all of them were divorced at least once. All of them had important love affairs outside of marriage. Uh, so it was a driving force in the life of all of them, and I think that's an important tale to tell.
Great.
Yeah.
And I think it
And
also,
Sandy doesn't talk much about Wendell Willkie's long, intimate relationship that he mentions once or twice.
Well, yeah, I mean, Wilkie's very much a beneficiary of the sexual revolution of the 1920s, and in many ways an uneven beneficiary in the sense that he was able to conceal his many dalliances and affairs over the course of his life from larger public view, and his political career benefited from this. So in some ways, he was a free spirit, and I think some people thought that was part of why they admired him, his sort of charisma, his political charisma, and other people found some of it quite distasteful. This is, of course, sort of running under a commentary in some commentary on him and his popularity. I don't talk much about it in the book because the so little of it is able to be corroborated, and the most famous is his supposed rumored dalliance with Madame Chiang Kai-shek while he was in China. Whether this is true or not is hard to say. It's become part of the sort of legend of that trip and of his people can read about it in the book.
Mm-hmm.
right, yeah. So let me switch to a different question. I'm going to merge a couple of them, which is to move us away from how Americans saw the world to how the world saw Americans. So, how were these particular figures viewed by sort of the people they met, whether in Paris and Berlin or Moscow or China? How was Wilkie's book read outside the United States? How was their journalism read outside the United States? And folding into this too, how much did they understand about the other cultures that they traveled to or were immersed in? And in particular, did they speak the languages of the places where they were working and really speak in languages other than English with the people that they were coming to understand as they were imagining this world?
Yes, I think the language question is very important. John Gunther did not speak any other language than English. He always had an interpreter with him, and he traveled to almost every country of the world. I'm sure it impaired his deep down knowledge, but what he became famous for was a very broad, sweeping investigation of many places. This was not in his newspaper journalism, but in his writing of the inside books. Sheehan actually was very different in that he was an amazing autodidact about languages, and he was really very adept in, I would say, at least 5 European languages by the end of the 20s. He didn't know any Asian languages, however, so that was a bar. And he didn't know Chinese, although he went to China. He didn't know Russian. But I find it hard to, and Dorothy Thompson, who dwelt most of her career on issues in Central Europe, spoke German very, very easily and apparently very badly in grammatical terms, but she was absolutely fluent. She had a lot of German friends when she came back to the United States. She had commented, he had become a friend of hers, that her garden was like Mittel Europa because everyone was speaking German. So she had no trouble, and she even translated things. In terms of how people abroad saw these folks, I don't have a very good take on that. That is, my sense is that Gunther's writings were celebrated around the world, with the exception of his book on Latin America, which was deeply criticized by Latin Americans and Latin American scholars in the US. That was a 1941 book. And because of anti-imperialism, some of Sheehan's work was criticized by, for instance, he and Winston Churchill had a sort of friendly but combative relationship. But that's about as much as I know because it was hard to get at that.
I mean, I think this is one of the things that can sort of be, and has often been said about Wilkie's journey, was that he essentially, as the phrase goes, parachuted into a bunch of places for sometimes just a day or a day or two. He spent 2 weeks in Moscow and 2 weeks in China, but most of the rest of the places were really quick 1 to 2 day stops. And he spoke none of the languages in the places that he went. He totally relied on interpreters. He relied in the Soviet Union on his friend who traveled with him, the journalist Joseph Barnes, who was sort of a contemporary of the Gunthers and Sheehans of the world, who had been a reporter in Moscow for years and years and years and spoke fluent Russian. But in other places, he really relied on the kinds of interpreters that he could get through the U.S. Diplomatic Corps there, even as he offended many of the diplomats there by his disinterest in their takes on things. So he had a sort of mixed relationship to the people that he met. Although what he was very good at doing was mobilizing his charisma to get past the official stories, the official narratives that were being put out by both the British and American and French diplomatic corps, to try to get beyond that, to see what some of the sort of rising generation of nationalists wanted from the world beyond the war. And so he was able to get some inside stories. I mean, I think more than some. I think he was able to get quite a few the inside stories. It was often the sort of more official nationalist stories, right? So, you know, he may not have met or always met the most radical sides of the growing anti-colonial forces in these places. He did probably amongst the Palestinians, probably less so amongst the Lebanese and Syrians that he met. He met both, I mean, he obviously was quite enthralled, and that's a whole other part of my book, with Chiang Kai-shek and Madame Chiang, but he also met Zhou Enlai. So he got a very mixed and varied set of perspectives about the world that was emerging. One World was received fairly rapturously around the world, simply because it was the first book to really present, well, maybe not the first, but to present from an American political figure this kind of idea that the world order really needed to be reshaped. Someone like Nehru read One World and said, it's really quite amazing that someone like this, with this sort of Midwestern American background, who could so quickly grasp what was needed to be done around the world. There were, however, some in other parts of the world, particularly in Iran and in Egypt, who were offended at the way that Wilkie sort of depicted what he found in Cairo and Tehran, right? The conditions in Cairo and Tehran. Wilkie was very much enamored of a kind of developmental perspective, where he saw what was needed was sort of Western standards, which the East was eager to meet, he thought, and eager to take up, and could do quite easily if they were only given a chance, right? He wanted to level that playing field, but he really did kind of ideas of Western growth and developmentalism that would later sort of cohere, or were cohering in those years, a sort of modernization ideology that would be so divisive amongst the anti-colonial forces of the post-war era, were really at work in Wilkie. I mean, this is a guy who made his name in the utility industry, right? Opposing the Tennessee Valley Authority, but also at the head of a holding company that worked to modernize the utility industry in the United States. So he knew his way around a dam project and electricity and all this stuff. And this was very much part of his ethos. So he embodied all that as well.
But it does sort of make us wonder if some of these forms of universalism, scientific and technological universalism, global English, were in fact some of the sticking points that prevented this one world from being the kind of internationalist undertaking that he really imagined it was.
Yeah, I mean, I think One World for him, he really never got to the point where he could adequately interrogate the sort of one world universalism, right? It was something that he saw emerging in a certain kind of way, but didn't understand how fractured it truly was underneath the surface. So in many ways, you know, I think Wilkie's sort of jubilant arc across the country that was just, or excuse me, across the globe that was so well received around the world in 1942. I mean, I think years later that would be seen a little bit more like the ugly American, sort of traipsing across the globe, not really understanding the world he was dropping into. So I think these things can sort of go from one side to the other very quickly. But I think it's important to think about how important it was that someone like Wilkie could arrive in the on the scene for Americans in this point and try to press them on these questions, despite these limitations in his thinking.
So we are nearing the end of our time, but I wanted to give you a final invitation to take the story up to the present, and maybe not in the way that that everyone asks you about, which is to ask you about Brexit or Donald Trump or the resurgence of the phrase "America First" or the crisis of journalism, but to see ask if there are sympathetic characters today who you see carrying on legacies in journalism or in political culture, in sort of building internationalism, people that we should be, people you like to read now, people you would like the audience members to pay more attention to, or who you think you wish they knew Wendell Willkie and Dorothy Thompson as well as you do.
That's a tough one. That is, I think there are numerous journalists who are positioned elsewhere who write really brilliantly about those places, and but some of the ones I've read, maybe in the New Yorker or the New York Times, Evan Osnos or Anne Bernard, Evan Osnos in China, Anne Bernard in the Middle East. Yeah, I don't know that they are as if a latter day incarnation. No, I don't think so. I think the conditions of this have really changed. But I will say that one thing that clearly has carried on is more from the three besides Gunther. That is, Sheehan's book, Personal History, began a rash of such books in which a journalist who had traveled and or lived in either many or maybe one particular part of the world wrote his personal views on what that meant. He really started that trend, which is, of course, still very, very, very common. And it was of very great interest to the American public in the mid-30s when his book was published. His was the first. Then there were three others, all of which were bestsellers in the mid-30s, which really does suggest a lot more appetite for news about the rest of the world than the label of isolationism or strict neutrality and peace would suggest. Thompson and Lippmann, of course, they were among the first columnists in the 30s. That is, op-ed type columns didn't even begin until the 1930s. And so her very inflamed commentary is also something she began, and we see it all too rife today, you might say, and it's everywhere. Also, Raina Raphaelson, about whom I've said very little, she went to China to simply dwell there and be of service, and she ended up writing for the Kuomintang, the nationalist, the left wing of the Nationalist Party there in their newspaper. And I think there are certainly people who reenact that today, Americans who go abroad where there is a social political movement going on and enmesh themselves and become part of it, and perhaps become communicators for it, which is what she did. So that they trail legacies of themselves. Gunther doesn't really, I don't think there's a taste for that kind of sweeping journalism characterizing the rest of the world now. But the other three have incarnations of a sort today.
Yeah, I think it's hard for there to be something like this today. And on the one hand, globalization has given all of us a sort of kind of relationship to the world, right? That we take for granted, and I think Americans take this access to the world for granted, and sometimes, many times, neglect our responsibilities to that relationship, and that is, I think, a product of our domination of globalization up until the last 10 or 15 years, right? The sort of power of the American empire to shape that relationship. So I think there's all kinds of people out there in the world these days, many of them not heralded, who sort of embody the ideas that these kinds of internationalist visions or ethos laid the groundwork for, right? So all kinds of people who work for internationalist organizations, people who are involved with UNESCO, people who are all involved with the World Health Organization, right? Working really hard right now, despite all the politics, to try to figure out what to do about the situation we found ourselves in. There's whole generations of and groups of these people who are unheralded. I mean, in terms of writers, I often found myself hoping that writers like Pankaj Mishra or Susie Hansen, who've written really well about the United States and its troubled past with the rest of the world, would read my book and understand a history that they probably don't know about, right? The sense that there was this moment during World War II where there were, were foreclosed possibilities that may have resources for us again today. So I think it's a matter of activating more people's kind of expansive relationship to the world and seeing that that's happening all around us all the time, and finding ways to make that less threatening to Americans and less threatening to our political culture, which I think maybe is the coming task of the generation coming after us, who will have to try to figure this out amongst all the other things that they're confronted with, right? The great global challenges of our time, of extinction, climate change, and all the others that people like Wilkie and Gunther and Raffleson and Sheehan and Thompson really could only have dreamed about, right?
All right. Well, on that note, I really want to just thank you both for a really wonderful conversation. It's rare on Zoom to say I wish it could go on longer, but I do wish it could go on longer, and I hope that everyone in the audience will join me virtually in thanking you for your contributions. And with that, I'll turn it back over to the staff of the Humanities Center.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you
Thanks,
very
everybody.
much.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you, folks, for tuning in.